Bernard de Montreal. Book Beyond the Mind. Chapter 10. Thought Pollution. Thought pollution is an indiscriminate aggregate of ideas incompatible with psychic reality. It leads to the degeneration of the harmony of the self with its inner nature. Failure to break the unremitting cycle of dissonant ideas creates a stream of consciousness that is a determining factor in the growth of the unconscious mechanical intelligence in the polluted self. The free will notion that underlies the psychological assumption of self-thought and autonomy of the unconscious thought process is illusory. And the persistence in maintaining this notion increases the personal and collective levels of thought pollution. It ignores the role of interdimensional intelligences in assisting or retarding the evolution of consciousness. Thought pollution is caused by the absence of knowledge of the inner occult mechanics of consciousness. The consequences for man and his world are of such magnitude as to destabilize the delicate balance of life forces at all levels of being reality. The material and psychological pollution of life is the inescapable result of thought pollution, and contemporary life concurs its quality by the illusions it entertains and perpetuates. The sound barrier has been broken, but we have yet to break through the barrier of light. This ultimate step will occur when the mind has been freed from thought pollution. The unveiling of knowledge essential to the understanding of our creative partnership with parallel dimensions is our reason for being on this material plane. Not until we free ourselves from self-serving, mind-polluting ideas, will we transmute the energy necessary for the acquisition of a science that would make it feasible to intermingle freely and creatively with intelligences that operate and evolve under conditions different from our own. Thought pollution bridles consciousness to an extent so great as to make life on Earth a living hell or an illusory paradise. It is coupled with the ego's total impotency and contributes to the antagonisms of our civilization. It straitjackets behavior through the dynamics of psychological patterns that scatter reality and hinder free access to the psychic dimensions of the mind. Contemporary science masks consciousness. It cannot free man from the shackles of gravity and the continuum of physical space. Not until the science of thought has been fully established and integrated will an ascendant civilization take root and begin reversing the degenerated trend of planetary consciousness. Until such time, we will perpetuate our illusions and persist in using our energy with diminishing returns in a field of unconsciousness, redeemable only by death. The difference between conscious and unconscious thought is equal to the difference between metaphysics and physics. Understanding the underground forces of thought and their origin is an inextricable part of the evolutionary development of consciousness. It cannot be acquired without the elimination of thought pollution that cripples the will to know, and weakens the power to shatter the mysteries that cloud the mind. Unlocking such mysteries transforms the human force field and protects it from global pollution of the biopsychic sphere that maintains a hold over the human organism. A hold through the genetic programming of the life forces, imprinted from the astral or soul plane. Thought pollution stifles man to such a degree that his consciousness needs psychological support systems in order to progress through life. Perpetual dissatisfaction with life is created from his psychic incapacity to free his thoughts from the genetic program of the soul. As a result, he cannot be happy on earth. His ego cannot satisfy itself with the fact that thought is simply pre-personal energy vibrationally adjusted to match the personality profile of the soul. The need to identify with thought itself forces the ego into a search for self instead of using thought as a creative catapult onto the path of discovery. Thought pollution is so much a part of our subjective mentality that we cannot fathom the nature of life. We live on the edge of consciousness and forego our right to intervene creatively in its global process. Rather than creating conditions for intelligent personal evolution, we submit to forces that constantly influence our emotions through subjective polluted thoughts, limiting our mental capacity to dissociate from thought pollution that prevents us from understanding the subtle nature and movement of vibrational energy. Human consciousness thrives on emotion and gathers experiences. Impressions influence and magnetize the mind. Pollution varies according to the experience needed by the soul, until freedom from such astral conditioning has been learned. With age, the ego comes under increasing existential stress and contributes unwittingly to the mechanical laws of the social system, short-circuiting the flow of energy from the higher to lower dimensions of its psychic and material consciousness. Insofar as we are living on an experiential path of development, we have little access to our integral reality and are compelled to live according to the forces that condition our unconsciousness. We seek answers to our lifelong dilemmas, but never find them in a jungle of ideas that have no real basis within the field of the conscious mind. Thought pollution deforms egoic reality, making it impossible to entertain conscious communication with a higher mental level where thought energy is created by the individual himself. The psychic connection between the ego, the soul, and the etheric source of the mind remains inaccessible. It is inconceivable that the psyche be clear until the insulating power of thought pollution is removed from it. Only then can we realize that much, if not all, of the partial knowledge we endorse is alien to the dynamic laws of creative intelligence. Thought pollution is formed from the endless consumption and assumption of subjective ideas and ideologies we hope will fill the void they themselves have created. It summarizes the insecurity of the ego in a world that is fast becoming a Super Bowl of impressions from which the mind cannot escape, unless it develops the will to stand alone before its psychic portrait. Pollution of the human mind has reached its maximum and most subtle level since the dawn of civilized consciousness. The system, be it secular or religious, has engineered ideas at the top that do not coincide with psychic reality at the bottom. It has increased the vulnerability of the ego to a perilous level and created a psychic mass of thought pollution, or egregore, that deadens human sensitivity. The commercialization of life has increased the division between men and fostered a quality of thought pollution never achieved in the annals of civilization. As it shifts from the ideological grip of religions and politics to that of economics, life will become an increasingly aggressive gesture against human nature, forcing more evolved individuals to retreat from the halls of conventional wisdom. Thought pollution grows from the inability to sustain and cultivate the inner qualities of self-knowledge. While the world is rapidly becoming a vast theater of incongruities, we find it increasingly difficult to wrench ourselves free from a pollution that is gnawing at the very core of our being. The unresolved problem of pollution experienced in our physical environment is proportional to its egregore experienced at the individual and collective level. Proof that the state of the psyche and the quality of civilization are intimately related. Human nature will forever seek a greater equilibrium between the physical world and the world of the mind. It is guided in its destiny and sustained by intelligence in a framework that must coincide with a creative potential. No amount of thought pollution, exquisitely refined or obviously decadent, may forever paralyze its society through the slavery of impressions that do not correspond to man's unbound psychic reality. The unconscious mind can temporarily adjust to thought pollution, but the self's inner flame never dies. Psychic pollution is proportional to our degree of ignorance of ourselves. It increases as we fail to live in accordance with a plan or destiny that corresponds to our individualized self, where soul and spirit are made one through a fusion process that brings out the person rather than the personality. It is not in our interest to support ideas and impressions that do not correspond to our inner knowledge. The self is so fragmented by the unconscious accumulation of self-justified thoughts or feelings that its memory meddles constantly with the movement of creative energy. Asphyxiated by the weight of unconscious memory, it loses touch with its inner dimension, threatening the delicate balance between the outer and inner dynamics of consciousness. Thought pollution prevents the individual from realizing the uniqueness of his nature. It disables him from being himself in totality, preventing the full development of his potential as a creatively conscious being. It is a measure of the lack of real development towards an integrated identity. While it reflects a highly personal state of mind, it is also the medium of the civilization in which we live. We cannot dissociate ourselves from its social impact and yet must free ourselves from its contamination. The dilemma lies in the fact that unless we are able to live up to our inner conditions of psychic freedom and knowledge, we cannot shield ourselves from the slavery of socially induced pollution. Thought pollution grows with our inability to think from an individualized mind center. Our thoughts are artificially constructed from astralized ideas of which we are not the architects. The indiscriminate accumulation of ideas, unfiltered by the conscious mind, prevents the development of our psychic centers. This turns us into mechanical thinkers whose thoughts are colored by the personality instead of developed by being intelligent. According to the social impact on personality, thought pollution will affect behavior patterns, leaving little space for creative action. The astral dimension of thought pollution is of such importance that it is impossible for man to realize its nature, unless he has some notion of the reality of astral forces at work on his mind. The essence of consciousness transpires with the awareness of astral pollution in thought. It allows clear and profound understanding of the psychic aberrations and distortions created in the collective psyche by the involutionary forces of civilization. The inevitable consequence for the unconscious ego is pollution of the thought experience by the influence of the death plane. Astral pollution comes from the manipulation of the mind by ageless subliminal forces that extend into the physical experience. Through subjective coloring of thought reflectively processed in the egocentric thought process. We cannot think consciously unless we are aware of influences that pervade our mind. Thought pollution is a cumulative graft of lower forms of intelligence emanating from parallel worlds upon the mental body. This occult activity is at the origin of egocentric consciousness, which is blind because the notion of forces from parallel planes affecting human consciousness is so foreign to our rational view of reality. We are unwittingly at the mercy of psychic forces that induce us into thinking we are free agents. Real freedom can only be achieved by understanding the metaphysics of thought, the occult dimension of psychic reality. The ego has its occult power structure as does civilization, And this underground comes alive through the astral manipulation of consciousness, which depends on psychic ignorance. The human experience thus influenced coincides with the level of evolution and needs of the soul, its psychic foundation. Thought pollution attacks real identity and retards the realization of man's multidimensional nature. It also prevents his psychic faculties from manifesting themselves, as the perception of creative impulses from a subtler psychic territory are thwarted and consummately misidentified. The unhindered perception of pure thought energy would link the lower and higher principles that ensure consciousness of the whole being, and protection from astral influence. The soul stresses the ego that is overloaded with uncreative thoughts. Without access to a permanent serenity necessary to the ebb and flow of the life forces, the ego attracts toxic ideas that constantly upset the delicate balance of the self's energy. The resulting unconsciousness is the origin of the cause of psychological ambiguities preventing real identity. It compels the ego to constantly adjust its subjective reality, which puts undue stress on the psyche. It corners the ego into a frame of mind equivalent to a psychic ghetto, from which it constantly seeks evasion. Thought pollution sets the unconscious self apart from its inner ground, dividing the self and creating contradictions within its experience. Pollution of ideas are crucial to the maintenance of secular or religious ideological values in a civilization where man has never been taught to think from his own center. They carry the seed of destruction of self-identity, and open the door to astral forces that correspond to a nihilistic determinism of global unconsciousness. They isolate the ego from its inner center, and destroy the creative nucleus inherent in all free intelligence. They misinform under the guise of a fictitious intelligence, highlighting the illusory limits and incapacity of the self to intervene freely in the karmic process of life. The psychic channels must be open to understand consciousness and develop a position of strength in contemporary civilization, whose influences affect the development of a centered consciousness. Thought pollution is the ultimate control of the human mind. Psychology must penetrate the psychic dimension of the mind if we are to benefit from a deeper understanding of the science of thought. The telepathic link with the mental plane elevates comprehension above the limitation of rational faculties, which are insufficient in grasping the nature of occult life forces at work. Interdimensional communication must be brought to the awareness of the evolving consciousness for it to recognize the universe as a multidimensional world, in which matter coexists with soul and spirit. This relationship can only be witnessed when the ego is able to objectively confront the psychic unknown. Thought pollution is corrosive and weakens man's grasp on life. It increases the power of the astral forces and diminishes those of the higher mind that underlie the very fabric of consciousness. Consciousness remains essentially experimental within the karmic cycle of life, which explains the age-long difficulty man has had in controlling his destiny. Thought pollution dictates experiential reality of soul evolution, until the higher mental plane is brought into focus through an objective inner understanding of the occult psychology of thought. Only then will thought evolution allow the creative and individualized consciousness to manifest itself, and free man from a repetitious experiential process which has been his lot since the genesis of soul incarnation. The concept of self must be raised to a higher level of mental understanding in order to facilitate the comprehension of the relationship between spirit, soul, and ego. This relationship creates a kind of interdimensional structure wherein intelligent forces actualize thought energy through the soul or memory implants, reflectively perceived at a lower mind level called ego. The release of the religious ideological grip on the modern mind has opened the gates to record levels of thought pollution, as secular media pulpits make their presence felt in the lives of millions. While the media has brought some form of control on moral or ethical abuses, it has replaced religious pollution by a secular kind that will increase man's psychic addiction by a margin never even coveted by religions. The search for inner balance is becoming increasingly difficult in a process of mind-busting that proposes to inform when in reality it simply formalizes through the gigantic machine of media uniformism and manipulation. Freed from the doctrinary ideologies of the past, modern man has been hijacked by astral powers bent on the elimination of his inner centers through the creation of a sophisticated reflective process of sound and image media magic, adroitly construed to deform the mentality of modern societies through the powerful incentive of financial wealth and power. The media's presence is so efficient it can afford to pay the entertainment elite of actors, comedians, singers, or sportsmen fees totally incompatible with the objective value of their craft. In a world where the greater majority is burdened by relative poverty, the uncentered ego becomes increasingly isolated from its inner self, and made heavily dependent on sound and image as a way of formulating a false sense of identity through hero worship. Thought pollution has become couched under the hypnotic label of freedom and success, while increasing numbers are losing their minds to resulting mental illnesses. Though man is, in appearance only, experiencing greater freedom, he remains a prisoner until he learns to deal with the thought pollution that deadens his inner sensitivity with sensations offered by the astral pollution in modern entertainment. Religious ideologies have polluted the mind as much as secular ideologies, but in a different way. In either case, man has been separated from his inner intelligence and enticed to think from centers of influence external to his own psychic reality. Modern freedom from religious doctrines has liberated a segment of humanity. Secular ideologies have captured the imagination of another. Man still remains captive. The chains of this condition will be broken, but the period of transition will give rise to excesses that confirm the need for an integrated inner center of thought. Contemporary life with its image and sound revolution that increases thought pollution, and the lack of an inner center as a protective shield for the ego, together and intercausal, produce the constant bombardment of subliminal impressions on the mind. Media overkill creates stress. The ego is made responsible for the conditions of its world, but has little power to change it fundamentally. This increases the individual's stress level and makes him more receptive to thought pollution, as he reflects on a world in greater difficulty than he would have realized had he not been bombarded by media overexposure. Thought pollution increases one's sense of isolation and impotence at the same time as it seeks to give him the impression that he can do something about it. The media may help correct certain evident abuses in the world, but thought pollution remains on the increase. The malaise amplifies. The greatest thought polluter is the media messenger whose images and sounds brainwash millions on a daily basis. Distrust towards the world causes the individual to free-float psychologically while his psyche remains imprisoned in a condition of inner stress that can only be relieved by the development of an inner center of thought. Modern man has more to live by but less to live for, the reason being that his psyche is put to sleep by a powerful and sophisticated industry that intentionally or unintentionally increases his sense of solitude and impotence. The clever use of imagery and sound makes much of little on the front stage of success, while the majority are left to dream helplessly on a wave of hero worship, whose idolatry is not unlike that of the ancients. The star syndrome isolates like never before the individual from himself, only increasing his sense of frustration. Thought pollution created by many of the so-called stars of the entertainment industry is of such consequence that even the most resilient individual can lose his identity for lack of an inner center of gravity. Few manage to salvage what is left of their reality, if only by isolating themselves from the in-crowd. The millions accumulated by the entertainment world are creating a slave market bent on making the mind a stage upon which art is sacrificed for a price under the label of freedom of expression. Governments, lacking political clout, were pressured into liberal attitudes in the 60s, while the drug problem was still in its infancy. A full generation later, they talk about the war on drugs, and will commit again the same mistake when confronted with the problem of satanic art or its other forms of dark manipulation protected by liberal weakness. Thought pollution is a fact of life today more than ever before. Once in the know, we realize the gigantic problem man faces before this invisible enemy. The answer does not lie with society or governments, but with the individual himself. It is he who is on the line. It is his own identity that must be recuperated. Only he can do the work for himself. No one can do it for him, and no one will.